Imagine your fiercest neighborhood critic suddenly learning that the rules she's enforcing were written by you. When I first moved into Cedar Grove Estates, I was excited about joining a tight-knit suburban community, new neighbors, weekend barbecues, and the promise of a peaceful retreat from the chaos of city life. I spent weeks getting to know everyone, learning the rhythm of our quiet street, and even volunteering to help update our community bylaws. Yes, that's right. I wasn't just a homeowner, I was one of the very minds behind the rules that keep our neighborhood running smoothly. At first, everything was just the usual growing pains of settling in. I was busy painting my new home, planting a modest garden, and even joining a few community committees. I figured if I played by the rules I helped create, life here would be smooth sailing. That was until Karen entered the picture. Karen was a longtime resident, self-appointed enforcer of every regulation and nuance of our little community. With her perfectly coiffed hair and a perpetual frown etched on her face, she prided herself on knowing every detail of the HOA guidelines. I noticed her immediately. Every time I trimmed my hedge a bit too high or parked my car a few inches off the curb, I'd see a note taped to my door with a polite but piercing critique. At first, I shrugged it off as a harmless quirk. But soon, Karen's criticisms escalated, and the notes became more than mere suggestions, they were stern warnings. One crisp fall morning, I returned home to find a brightly colored envelope resting in my mailbox. My curiosity piqued, I tore it open, only to be greeted by a formal notice outlining a brand new rule that the HOA had apparently just adopted. The notice was written in Karen's unmistakable tone, condescending, overbearing, and dripping with self-righteous authority. According to the notice, all homeowners were now required to install aesthetic window coverings that matched a specific shade of blue, a rule that was as absurd as it was sudden. I couldn't help but laugh. After all, I had been deeply involved in drafting our community bylaws. I knew the process from the inside out. This new rule was nothing more than a misinterpretation, if not a blatant misuse, of our bylaws. And I knew I had the evidence to prove it. The next day, I strolled over to Karen's house. I wasn't exactly nervous. If anything, I was eager to set the record straight. There she was, meticulously rearranging her meticulously trimmed rose bushes as if she were conducting an orchestra. When she saw me approaching, her expression morphed from one of busy perfectionism to smug superiority. "Good morning," she said coolly, barely glancing up from her work. "I assume you received the update regarding the new window covering rule?" I smiled, drawing a deep breath. "I did, Karen. And I have to say, I'm a bit puzzled." I pulled out a neat folder from my bag. Inside lay a copy of our original bylaws and my annotated notes from the drafting sessions. You see, I was actually part of the committee that drafted these bylaws. And as far as I remember, there was no mention of a mandatory blue window covering requirement. In fact, the bylaws explicitly state that any amendments must be approved by a majority vote of the homeowners. Karen's confident smile faltered for just a moment, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. "Well, rules evolve, and sometimes the community needs a little guidance," she insisted, trying to reclaim her authoritative tone. "Guidance or overreach?" I countered gently, stepping closer. "Karen, I'm not trying to undermine the community's standards. I'm simply pointing out that the rule you're enforcing is based on a misinterpretation of the bylaws, something that I literally helped write. There's no provision for an arbitrary mandate like this without proper amendment procedures." Her eyes widened, and for a long moment, the only sound was the rustling of leaves in the gentle autumn breeze. The neighbors, who had gathered discreetly at a distance, watched with rapt attention as Karen's posture began to sag under the weight of undeniable evidence. "You can't be serious," she finally whispered, a hint of panic lacing her voice. "You drafted these bylaws? Then how can you say I'm wrong?" I nodded calmly. "That's exactly right, Karen. I helped draft these bylaws, and I'm well aware of every clause. The window covering rule isn't just baseless, it's not even legally enforceable without following the proper channels." At that moment, the tension was palpable. Karen's hands trembled as she clutched a crumpled version of the notice she'd issued. I could see her mind racing for a legal loophole or some obscure clause to salvage her position, but it was clear that the truth was firmly on my side. Not long after our confrontation, the community bulletin board lit up with murmurs of disbelief. Some neighbors expressed their support for Karen's enthusiasm for community standards, while others marveled at the irony of the situation. After all, who would have thought that the person enforcing the rule so zealously could be caught in their own web? That evening, I received an email from a fellow board member asking for clarification on the issue. I took the opportunity to explain everything in detail, attaching scanned copies of the original bylaws and my notes from the meeting. The response was swift and unequivocal. Karen's new rule was invalid. It was a simple case of misinterpretation compounded by overzealous enforcement. The next day, during the community meeting, I was invited to address the issue formally. Standing in front of a room filled with neighbors, I calmly presented the facts. I explained how amendments to the bylaws are a collective decision and not the prerogative of any single individual, even one as determined as Karen. I highlighted the importance of transparency, proper procedure, and most importantly, the value of knowing your rights and responsibilities as a homeowner. As I wrapped up my presentation, a hushed silence fell over the room. Then, one by one, people began to nod in agreement. It was clear that my message had resonated. Karen, sitting in the back, avoided eye contact, her earlier bravado completely dissolved. By the end of the meeting, the board unanimously voted to nullify the disputed rule and reaffirmed the original bylaws. Later that day, I received a text message from a neighbor. "Thanks for standing up for us. You saved our community from some really arbitrary rules." I smiled, knowing that while it was just a small victory in the grand scheme of things, it was a victory for fairness and democracy. Now, whenever I reflect on that tumultuous time, I can't help but chuckle. It's a reminder that sometimes the ones who claim to be the guardians of order end up entangled in their own misinterpretations. And for those of us who are part of a community, it's a powerful lesson. Never be afraid to question authority, especially when you have the knowledge and evidence to back you up. So, if you ever find yourself at odds with someone enforcing rules in a way that seems completely off base, remember, know your rights, keep your cool, and always be prepared to show the facts. In the end, truth and a well-drafted bylaw will always prevail.